Good afternoon. I'm Anthony King. Thank you for joining us. Um, this session is about smoke impact. And as you know, in 2020, we had some of the most destructive fires in Oregon that we've had in recorded history. We had 21 distinct fires that ranged up and down the state, including smaller localized fires that were in very close proximity to vineyards. The biggest issue was that right around Labor Day, right as the fires were being brought under control, we had strong eastern dry winds that kicked up fires and essentially blanketed the whole west coast of Oregon, causing issues for all of us. If you're like me, you were sitting in smoke, felt traumatic, not to think about the people like those in Talent who were actually having their homes burned down and businesses. Um, One of the things that was nice is the industry came together, and Oregon Wine Board and ERATH Foundation decided to take this year as an opportunity to look at numbers across the state. And if you didn't get to look at those numbers that were presented this morning by Elizabeth Tomasino and James Osborne, please look at the recording. They're comprehensive, grape, free, and total smoke impact numbers that are very interesting to look at, and that research will be ongoing. In this session, I want to introduce Anita Oberholster from UC Davis. I wanted to name this session Anita Know More About Smoke Impact, but I got overruled. Anita is a really incredible resource for the entire world wine industry, just a consummate extension specialist, has been at UC Davis since 2011, has a PhD from University of Adelaide. Is that correct, Anita?
Yes, University of Adelaide.
Yeah. Her fields of studies are tannin, flavor compounds, effects of vinification methods, barrels, sustainability. It really means that she could speak in any of our sessions, and her expertise isn't just limited to enology. Meanwhile, she's been a huge resource for our industry of compiling data and information for smoke impact in specific, and working with trials at UC Davis. So with that, I would like to introduce Anita Oberholster, who will present what we know about grape exposure impact, or grape smoke exposure. To you, Anita.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for that very, very nice introduction. Now I'm going to hope to live up to all those high expectations. First, I want to say thank you very much for this opportunity to present at the Oregon Wine Symposium. I'm really sad that it can't be in person, and then I can take part in the session Up in Smoke Part 2. And Anthony said what I was going to talk about. I'm going to try and summarize everything that we do know about smoke impact. And let me start off by saying, unfortunately, we still do not know even close enough. We have a lot of work ahead of us. So I don't have to convince you what an important impact this is, but just as a general introduction, the US grape and wine industry is very important. We add almost 220 billion to the annual economic activity, provide 1.7 million jobs. 43 million tourists normally visit wine regions annually in the US. The economic impact has been estimated by economic analysts to be around 3.8 billion lost from 20 billion in wholesale revenue in 2020 alone. We had 6 out of the 7 largest wildfires in California just in 2020. I apologize for the California reference, but this is where I am. The fact is that climate experts and resource managers all agree that we're going to see wildfires with greater intensity and more frequency like we've seen in the past few years in the future. And this is our new tomorrow, and we need to find ways to manage this better. So first, on a brighter note, let me educate you a little bit about wine taints. So what is a wine taint? A wine taint is when something comes from outside, it overpowers a wine and make it one-dimensional, thus decreasing the quality. When you're talking about smoke taint, it's when you have specifically more smoky, burnt, campfire, medicinal, earthy characters. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, People also get a lot of bread-like aromas. You can get bacon, barbecue, etc. But for me, very distinctive for smoke taint is that lingering retronasal ashtray character. Sometimes it's more like an old campfire character at the back of your throat when you expectorate the wine that you perceive. Now, what happens during a wildfire? During a wildfire, you have a lot of wood burning. Now, 15 to 25% of wood is lignin, and that's the structure you can see there on the left. Now, when it burns, it thermally degrades, and you can get a release of a large amount of compounds that has a ring structure with an OH group on it, and that is a phenolic. This specifically is a guaiacol, a volatile phenol, one of the main marker compounds that I think you all have heard about by now. So when you have a fire burning, you have excessive amount of a range of compounds that look like this being released in the air, and they can disperse. This dispersion will depend on wind currents, temperature conditions, and they can also use debris like ash as carriers to move further. They do degrade in the atmosphere quite quickly within hours, but atmospheric conditions will dictate how quickly that happens, as well as their absorbance on carriers may impact their degradation. These are all things we're not certain about, and we need to investigate further. But just to put this in context, when you're toasting a barrel, and I know at the top right, that's more like charring for bourbon, but when you're toasting a barrel, you sort of have the same impact, just in a much smaller scale. Then you're releasing small amounts of guaiacol and other kind of volatile phenols to give you interesting, spicy, toast-like aromas that actually adds to the complexity of your wine. This is really an instance of too much of a good thing isn't a good thing anymore. Now, a barrel will never give you bound. It will only give you free volatile phenols. But I've never seen a control wine that's never seen any smoke in a barrel develop smoke taint. So there is this elevated level off that you won't get from a barrel that can cause a problem. Something else to remember, as soon as your wine has seen any kind of oak chips, oak staves, a barrel, those free volatile phenol numbers are compromised and you can't use it to look at smoke impact. We can't predict how much volatile phenols a barrel will contribute. There's a lot of barrel variability, and it's almost impossible to figure out what came potentially from smoke, from the grapes, or from the oak. Now you have your grape berry. Say you have fresh smoke coming into your vineyard surrounding your grape bunches. These molecules absorb very quickly through the skin, and they're stored in the inner skin layers. So they're not on the outside. You can't remove them. You can't wash them off. And in the berry, within a very short period of time, they get glycosylated. Well, that means there's an enzyme in the berry that can put various sugars on the range of volatile phenols that gets absorbed into the berry. It could be a mono, a di, or tri sugar. So now you get an idea how complex this is. We're talking about a large potential amount of compounds that can be a future problem in the wine. So in the beginning, most people only analyze guaiacol and 4-methyl guaiacol. Those are the two in the red circle, because that's what we were already analyzing for oak analysis and other kind of aroma analytics. However, very quickly, the Australian Wine Research Institute and the University of Adelaide, these are the people that started smoke impact research in the early 2000s when they had huge wildfires impacting their own wine regions. And they realized you don't have enough predictive power if you only analyze those two. And they expanded it to at least these 7. But you'll see most labs and even researchers sometimes have a few other additional compounds that they look at as well to see if there's others that also add to smoke taint prediction. But quickly they realized that these compounds aren't stable. They're increasing in the wine. How can that be? And realized there's precursors, and that's when they went looking for it and found the different glycosides. Now, currently, the Australian Wine Research Institute, their commercial lab does 7 free volatile phenols, the ones I'm showing here. In addition, they also do 6 bound volatile phenol glycosides. Because this is unfortunately the situation you can have. You have a little bit of free and a lot of bound. Now, this ratio is not constant. At this point in time, we do not know what dictates this ratio. We think timing of exposure may play a role, Perhaps does variety play a role? Does atmospheric or climate conditions play a role? The fact is, it's inconsistent and you do not know. So if you only look at the free, you do not know how much bound is there. That every time you remove the free, perhaps there's just more bound to reestablish that equilibrium. This is the initial method that was developed by Yoji Haisaka at the Australian Wine Research Institute. And as you can see, the ones highlighted are the 6 that they're actually analyzing in the commercial lab, but that's more. And I can tell you the researchers at University of Adelaide and British Columbia and here in the US will look at anywhere from 20 to 30 different bound compounds. We still need to figure out what are the best marker compounds to analyze because it's such a complex issue. Now, you can do acid hydrolysis. Some labs do that. It's easier because you basically use harsh acidic and high temperature conditions to cleave all the glycosides, and then you get a total free number. Why some people don't like it is because you can get an overestimation. Does what you release really relate to what happens in a wine during winemaking conditions? People that look at, researchers that look at all the individual compounds never get mass balance, meaning there's always more released by acid hydrolysis. However, that number can have some value. It gives you some idea of what's potentially still there. And if you build up a reference comparing baseline grapes that weren't impacted with impacted and see what number relates to a smoke impacted wine, over time, that value will have more meaning. Currently, we don't have a lot of ways to interpret those numbers. This is a study a lot of people refer to. A really cool study. They did this over 3 seasons on Merlot vines. They intentionally smoke exposed them during key growth stages and found that as soon as you have a berry, they're susceptible to smoke impact. However, they're the most susceptible from berry hazon to ripening, till harvest, when the skin softens. However, talking to the Australians after their own horrific wildfire season during their last harvest, they're thinking we may have to revisit this. They had some vineyards that was only exposed to smoke when the grapes were rock hard pea size, and they were heavily impacted. So unfortunately, at this point in time, we have to say that if you have a grape there, they're potentially impacted if they were exposed to smoke. The good news is there is no carryover effect. Okay? These things get absorbed onto the leaves and onto berries. They don't overwinter. Next year, you start fresh. So I hear some people say there's smoke everywhere. Every year is going to smell that smoke. Well, if you have fires every year, yes. But if you don't have a fire, you don't have to worry about smoke. So what happens during winemaking? Because these compounds are linked to glycosides, they're very hydrophilic, so very soluble in a water medium. You crush the grapes, they're in the skins, they extract pretty quickly. There's one study in Merlot wines that looked at how quickly they extract. They looked at after 1 day, 5 days, 3 days, 5 days. And you can see after 5 days, you already got 80% of your volatile phenols. Now, also in the acidic wine medium, you slowly get hydrolysis of the glycosides. It's only a small percentage. There's not a lot of studies. Study we did, we only saw about 25 to 35% hydrolysis of the potential glycoside precursors. Another study from Australia found like a 50% increase until after malolactic fermentation. But they started with intentionally smoked grapes that had something like 200 micrograms per liter of guaiacol in it. I definitely think concentration will have an impact on the speed of extraction. Very importantly, both the free and the bound compounds extract both do contribute to your sensory impression of smoke taint. The thing is, the free you smell, the bound obviously you can't smell, they're not aromatic. But a study has shown that we have bacterial enzymes in our saliva that can actually hydrolyze these compounds. And we think that this contributes to that retronasal character that you perceive. It is as it gets hydrolyzed in your mouth that you're perceiving the smokiness. I do think that any technique that enhances color extraction, you probably may enhance volatile phenol glycoside extraction as well. They're both bound to glycosides and they're both in the skins. A lot of people ask me or say to me, I mean, Anita, if we only had threshold values. The problem is we have threshold values of these compounds individually in water, in model wines, in base wines. The problem is those threshold values are way higher than we perceive problems in wine. And this is because they are looked at as an individual compound. However, in a wine matrix, it's very different. We know firstly that you will have to look at different combinations of these volatile phenols together because they have different synergistic impacts. And then you'll have to determine it for different varieties and different wine styles potentially. And we hope we can say one day that for Pinot Noir with this wine style, this is your threshold levels for these compounds, but we're not there yet. We know a low amount of sugar, as little as 3 grams per liter, can actually hide some of the smoke taint character. Higher ethanol suppresses the character. A lot of estery fruity aromas can mask it. Green aromas like pyrazines can, unfortunately, green pepper can enhance smokiness on the nose. And we may go on. There's an interesting study that the University of Adelaide did. They had all these wines where they intentionally smoked the grapes and didn't smoke them. So they have controls. And 5-6 years later, they went back to them to see, okay, what does the free versus bound ratio look like after 5 to 6 years of bottle aging? And what do the sensory perceptions look like? When they did the analysis, both the control wines that never saw smoke and the smoke impacted wines actually had an increase in free and decrease in bound. Now, they said it wasn't that much because I looked at the absolute values of alcohol release and so forth. But when I look at free versus bound, it sometimes was anything from 40 to 50% of the bound got released to free, or a 40 to 500% increase in the free, I should say. That's enough to have an impact. When they did sensory evaluations, the controls were still not impacted, but the impacted wines were more impacted than before. They say it's because the phenolic levels went down, and obviously your fruity aroma and everything else went down, making the smoke stand out more. But I think it's probably a combination of that and the increase in the release of bound volatile phenols. What about risk? I had a lot of questions this past season about risk. Unfortunately, all we know now is that the fresher the smoke, the greater the risk. I told you that volatile phenols in the air break down within a matter of a few hours. We've had some anecdotal evidence that if smoke is older than 24 hours, they have less risk. So this is why air quality index parameters and smoke taint risk doesn't go well together. They correlate better when the smoke is fresh. So yes, very dense fresh smoke has your highest risk, but all dense smoke, we don't know. Your risk definitely lowers. The problem is when you have fires everywhere, how do you know what is fresh smoke and what do you know what is old smoke? And that is the problem. There's a lot of questions also about washing grapes. So we know washing grapes won't remove any of your absorbed volatile phenols because they're inside the skin, not on the outside. But what about ash? This year, there was a lot of ash even falling in Davis, and I collected ash. And we took a gas chromatographer mass spectrometer, we took an SPM valve, put the ash in there, and the conditions are 50 degrees Celsius, and you're agitated. And yes, it did release volatile phenols, and it released it for about a week. So that was concerning to me. However, is it worthwhile trying to wash off ash in the vineyard? While it's in the vineyard, does it really do anything? If you wash it off, it's just lying on the vineyard floor. Wet ash gives off more volatile phenols than dry ash. That is something Tom Collins told me from Washington State University. So it's a conundrum. And anyway, we don't think that you should be wetting your grapes at all when there's smoke in the air. So you have to wait until the smoke clears. I'm more concerned about fresh ash being on the grapes when you process them for winemaking. We have washed grapes and not washed grape and do analytical analysis and found no difference in the volatile phenol numbers. Winemaking with fresh ash is something that we need to look into. And both myself and Tom Collins did some experiments on this. A lot of questions about barrier sprays. There's been a couple of studies about putting a grape spray on the grapes that can protect it from the smoke. So there was a study from the University of Adelaide and AWRI looking at kaolin, and they found that It worked, had some success for Merlot, but didn't work for the two other varieties. They told me the variable impact is due to timing of application, how long before the smoke exposure, as well as the fact that you only get 30 to 40% coverage when you're actually applying an agent like that in the vineyard. Then there was a study from British Columbia where they found some really good results for biofilms. So they looked at two fungicides that had like an oily sticker, and that actually made it worse. So this makes us really concerned about applying anything in smoky conditions. Because if you have something that's wet and doesn't dry in the berry, that gives it an extra surface area to dissolve the volatile phenols. Perhaps it is like a conduit into the berry. I don't know what it does to the waxy layer of the berry. With the biofilm, this is a phospholipid biofilm called Parcam. They found a lot of success the first time they tried it on Pinot Noir. But I know they repeated the study doing different kinds of applications and timing of application before smoke exposure. And that results didn't look as good. So we definitely still have more work to do there. And there's a lot of other companies that have products available that they think may actually be positive for protecting grapes and that we need to evaluate. Currently, mitigation, if you're processing grapes, currently we say for white wines, gentle processing. If at all possible, not always possible, hand picking, because you want as little damage to the skins as possible so it doesn't leach volatile phenols into your must and juice. Exclude mock, because we say it's in the leaves, and rakers, we're not sure about. This season, I said, avoid if you can. Light pressing, keep press fractions separate. Definitely that mechanical force more of the volatile phenols into the solution. And then what about finding of juice with activated charcoal? We know finding of activated charcoal does reduce the amount of volatile phenols. And it's many times better to treat as early as possible so that you have more winemaking tools that you can use to build back up the flavor that you have lost. Obviously, this is just an option if you know for a fact that your grapes are impacted. Fruity yeast to build body with different winemaking tools. Then for red wines, you have unfortunately less options because a red wine, you need skin contact. I would say for low to medium smoke impacted grapes, you can use fruity yeast, light tested oak with no smoky related characters to try and uplift the fruit, give complexity and hide the smoke. For rosé, if it's an economic viable option, just remember, with a rosé, you have a much simpler matrix. So even though you're extracting much less, it can stand out more easily. It's something to remember. I know people that have inventory that wasn't impacted did things like just quickly press it off the skins and donating skins from non-impacted fermentations and did a fermentation that way with quite a bit of success. So in 2017, when we had the fires in Napa, that's when my smoke impact research actually started. I had a grapevine red blotch virus study that was impacted, and we went and harvested everything that was left at Oakville. We also I got grapes from the Silverado Trail and from Alexander Valley. It's all Cabernet Sauvignon. So we had all these grapes, and I had to decide what to do. And I looked at all the recommendations from the Australians, and many times they use different winemaking conditions, different varieties, and different yeast and other products than what we have available here. So I thought, okay, let me look at the impact of yeast. I chose these 4 yeasts. I looked at 2 different oak chips that have a profile of just giving suppleness and fruity freshness characters. Queer tannin, that is a ellagic tannin that they recommend. Then the enzyme plus tannin control, that's something that Ford wanted me to try out. It's just an enzyme to get all the color out, stabilize the color with an added tannin, press after 3 days, and then complete fermentation without skins. And Alexander Valley, I looked at fermentation temperatures. All had 7 days of skin contact, even the 10 degrees cold soak. It was 7 days on 10 degrees, press it off, and then finish fermentation. Because there was so many wines, we had to do 2 descriptive analysis panels. We did it our old way where we recruit a panel, they come up with descriptors, we train them on the reference standards, check them for consistency, and then evaluate in booths using colored glasses. So this is the principal component analysis of the results. It's only the significant attributes that you see here. On the left, you see the unsmoked controls. So the next piece here I'm going to show you, I just took that out. You can see the rest a little bit more clearly. Now, if you look here, there's ashy aftertaste. Now, smokiness, unfortunately, was not significantly different among any. There was a lot of carryover. We did these panels the normal way, 6 wines at a time, 1 minute wait between each wine, rinsing your mouth with water, and there was carryover. And also, if you look at smoky aftertaste, it looked like BDX and D80 worked, but there was large variability among reps. And I can tell you, when I went back to these wines, that over time, it just came back. It was really good at hiding it for a while, and then that ashy aftertaste came back. And that is my problem. I think on low impact, it may make a difference, but I don't know how long it lasts. The same for Nobili Fresh in this instance worked better than Nobili Base or the queer tanning. But I think a lot of this would also be wine matrix dependent, because I can tell you some of the yeast that worked well for me was one of the yeast that didn't work at all for the AWRI study. That shows you the impact of the wine matrix. Then we learned and we realized, okay, let's try and evaluate less wines at a time for our second panel. Unfortunately, this happened in 2018, and we were impacted by the 2018 fires. The air quality was so bad in Davis, they closed the university for 2 weeks so that people don't have to exit their houses. So we ended up having to push a lot of wines to get the study done before the exams, because a lot of our evaluators or panelists are students. But here, smoky aftertaste wasn't significantly different, meaning that all of them had a low level of it, including my unsmoked controls, indicating carryover. And if you look at the smokiness here, that's on the nose, you'll see that fermentation temperature with 7-day contact time really did not have any huge impact at all. It may look like the enzyme treatment worked, but it had a moldy kind of character on the nose, and it really just masked the smoke. So I didn't think it actually worked. It was really no better than any of the other wines we tried. The next year in 2018, I started focusing more on amelioration, looking at different treatment techniques. If you did whatever you can, you end up with a smoke-impacted wine. What now? Looking at different enzymatic treatments, I tested a range or screened a range of food-grade enzymes that's available in the market with absolutely no success, even at high concentrations for 6 weeks. The Australians told me they tested even a larger amount of enzymes. They only found a couple that could cleave the glycosidic bond from serengol, but not consistently, and not the rest. So they're not even recommending an enzyme. At this stage, we're at the stage where we have to say we'll have to engineer a specific enzyme to find an enzymatic solution for this problem. Finding, I looked at both activated charcoal, and the Australians have a long list. The AWRI have a list on their website of all the different charcoals that they tried and what worked better in wine and what worked better in juice. If you do any kind of finding, please go and check that out. And molecular imprinted polymers. So molecular imprinted polymers is where they use on a polymer the molecular imprinting technique. And basically what it does is, there's a schematic of it. It creates a cavity that has in a polymer matrix that has a high affinity for your template molecule. So in our case, this would be volatile phenols. So the volatile phenols will get stuck in this matrix, and that is how it removes it. Then reverse osmosis, we tried both the standard treatment and differential filtration, where it first gets separated into different molecular weight fractions and then treated, and then spinning cone technology. So I still have my 2017 wine, which I saw low to medium impact. And then the 2018 fires in Lake Mendocino County, I got gifted grapes that was very close to the fires. That is my high impact. And I kept the press and the free run wine separate. So I had a very high impact, which was my press wine, high impact. And then I got grapes a little bit further away from the fire that I saw medium impact, and I saw my Oakville wine from 2017 as a low to medium impact. I couldn't do all the treatments on all the wines because sometimes I didn't have enough wine for that specific treatment. But overall, this is the results. This is the graph of the free volatile phenols all added together. And what I want to point out here, So you can see all the techniques worked. They all decreased the volatile phenols to a significant amount. Remember, you don't have to remove everything. There's volatile phenols in grapes in any case. You just need to remove enough that during the lifetime of that wine, it won't get to a number again where it's above threshold for that specific wine. So in this case, Mulligan printed polymers work the best for volatile phenols, and then RO, then the activated charcoal, and then spinning cone. When we look at the total numbers, so this is free plus bound, it looks a little bit less impressive. Because the fact is, all these techniques works pretty well for the free and remove only a small amount of the bound. However, you can see that especially for your low to medium impact, this may be enough to have a real impact and remove the smoke impact. We did sensory descriptive analysis again. This time learning, we rinsed our mouths with 0.5% pectin in between tastings and waited 90 seconds. And la-da, we had no smoke impact carryover during our sensory study, finally. So that did the trick. Now, if you look there in the left bottom, that's our control non-smoke impacted wines. That's always good. On the right, you can see there's ash. That is the retronasal character and the back of the throat. And peat with smoke is on the nose. You can see it's orthogonal to that, so not impacted at all. And if you look here on the left, you can see these treatments, wine 3 and 4, that was the low to medium and medium impacted wine. All the treatments worked really well to reduce or remove the smoke impact. It's definitely matrix dependent. I think if you have a highly impacted wine, you're going to struggle, except if you can dilute it and blend it away, because you will have to treat it so much that by that time you have taken so much of the rest out of the wine that gives it body and aroma. Because all these techniques, unfortunately, lack specificity, and you remove more than just the compounds that's creating a problem for you. So bench trials are definitely a necessary element here. And just because one technique works the best for one wine, unfortunately, that is no guarantee that that is the best technique to use for another. So to summarize amelioration techniques, unfortunately, enzyme changes don't work. Definitely don't try it in the juice. The sugars for most of the food grade enzymes out there will inhibit the enzymes. Fining, activated charcoal work, reverse osmosis works, spinning cone works. Like I said, they lack specificity. They do take up some color, not that extensive. You can't usually see it with the naked eye. They do take some body out. Spinning cone also removes some alcohol. I didn't replace that alcohol. There's ways to blend it away, etc., because that alcohol loss was significant and does impact body as well. I get a lot of questions about flash detant. Now, flash detant actually doesn't remove that much volatile phenols. There's some volatile phenols trapped in the flash water, but the conditions of flash detant is not severe enough that you're actually breaking those glycosidic bonds. You don't actually lose the precursors. However, because flash detant extracts so much stuff, I want to say, there's so much color and phenolics and aroma and fruity aromas in that wine, it totally masks the smoke taint. The problem is I'm not 100% sure how long this masking effect will last and if that will be good enough for a highly impacted wine. Now, how do we determine smoke exposure risk? Now, the best way would be for us to get baseline data. The Australians did this. They analyzed over 500 grape and wine samples from several regions for their 12 top varieties. And now when they do analysis, they can actually give their data and the background of baseline. Now you can see the baseline range is pretty large, okay? However, it still gives you a better indication of how to evaluate or interpret your data. Now, you will say you'll almost have no risk. I won't say no risk, almost no risk. If, say, your sample come back as the middle of baseline, you're pretty safe. Say your data come back here with a little star. You're like, you're not right in the middle. That is a maybe, maybe not. That is a gray zone. maybe, maybe not. But then you have above baseline. And above baseline, you're pretty sure that you're going to be impacted, right? You're at high risk of making a smoke-tainted wine. At least having baseline data will decrease that gray area of maybe, maybe not, and help us to make more informed decisions. And this is something we need to get working on. Next thing is threshold values. Yes, if we can determine for a range of different volatile phenol concentrations, and say for a specific variety and wine cell, what is the threshold level? Below this level, you're good and consumer will totally accept your product, great. But above this level, consumers will reject it because they will see it as tainted. So basically, the best would probably be if we have both. If we both have threshold values and baseline values, those two parameters will help us decrease our gray zone by a large, large margin. Less uncertainty, that's what we all want. The current recommendations, and unfortunately for this coming season, it will probably still be the recommendation we would do, is take a berry sample as close to harvest as you can. Don't take it early on after your first smoke event. Some people here took berry samples 3 times and it just overruns the labs. Wait until close as harvest as you can. Keep some of it as a reference for if you have to go back to it for legal action or anything else. Do small lot fermentations, especially if labs only do 3. Because that small lot fermentation, at least some of that bound gets released during the fermentation. And your sensory organs can taste the bound. Use yourself as an analytical tool. I made a little video to show how to do the small-scale fermentations. It was out without a script, so don't judge me. There's the website. We have a website with information for all smoke-related stuff, and the video is there. I'm definitely not going to be an actress anytime soon. When you do sensory evaluations of these small-scale fermentations, be aware that they say the Australians tell me 20 to 25% of people they found aren't very sensitive or can't see smoke taint at all. So if you want people to evaluate your wine, make sure that they can actually taste it. So you need to have like a high impact standard and a control. I always have a control that's not smoke impacted because I find some people taste smoke everywhere because they're convinced it should be there. Carry over, rinse with water, wait 2 minutes. If you only rinse with water, wait 2 minutes between tastings. Have 3 or more people because you want a majority, right, of opinion. The Australian use a very simple 9-point rating scale. I think it's smart. 1 rating on the nose for all related characters for smoke taint, 1 rating by taste for all related characters. What did I do this harvest? Well, I was planning to do only bench trials and do some analytical optimization. I'd ended up making hundreds of ferments I didn't plan on. We did a lot of micro and bucket fermentations and relating to research scale and larger scale winemaking. My micro is in French presses. There's a photo of it down here in the water bath. And there's my buckets, mostly 5 gallons. We tried to speed up bucket fermentations. I know we say it's only 5 days, but if you want to taste it, it needs to be dry. Most of my fermentations took more than a week to go dry. And then you still have to clarify it. And that took another week. So it was more like 2 weeks. So we tried high biomass, high nitrogen, ethanol extractions without doing and tasting that without doing fermentations, and a severe method of high temperature and high alcohol. We still have to analyze all these things. I'm months behind because of COVID regulations. And also, we did this for 12 different varieties from 5 different regions. We'll go back next year, fingers crossed, and get some baseline data as well. And really start working on varietal impact and the best ways to evaluate grapes for potential smoke impact risk. Also, I looked at more applied questions like ash versus no ash, impact of rakers doing whole cluster pressing for Torontos and whole cluster fermentations for Cabernet Sauvignon, looking at activated charcoal finding in the juice versus in the wine for Torontos and Sauvignon Blanc, rosé versus red wine for Cabernet Sauvignon, free run and press fractions, keeping them separate, evaluating them. And then I got also a lot of grapes gifted. Thank you very much for an industry reference standard. I made about, 1,500 gallons. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's the perfect high impact standard for smoke taint. And I hope as soon as we can do in-person workshops again, to do workshops, train people how to do evaluations of their own small scale fermentation, send them home with a bottle of high impact wine that they can use that as a calibration of this is 9 on the scale. Take home message: smoke doesn't equal smoke tank. That's the good news. Smoke tank marker analysis has limited predictive capacity, especially if you're analyzing free volatile phenols. I don't say don't do it. You have to do it. You have a 50-piece puzzle, and that's a couple of the pieces. You have to do as much as you can to get as many of the pieces as you can, so that hopefully you can guess what the full picture will look like. There's no known mitigation currently in the vineyard, limited mitigation in the winery with yeast and oak and phenolic extraction and a little bit of sugar. Enumeration treatments, they work, but they lack specificity. They do impact overall wine quality. It will work best when your wine needs limited impact, or you can blend the treated wines. Very quickly, I know I've been long, I have to acknowledge the funding I've received up to this point. Without money, we unfortunately can't do anything. Thank you so much. And all the people, my students and the winery and other that just helped and put a lot of hard work in to make some progress on this very, very, very important question. Thank you very much. That's a few photos from Harvest 2020. And that's my story. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Anita. I have a few follow-up questions for you, just to set us up for the session that we have following with winemakers. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that there's multiple different ways of analyzing volatile phenols in both grapes and in wine, and you talked about microferments. You also mentioned that there's 7 free volatile phenols that they have talked about in Australia and 6 bound as the best correlation. And I wondered what you've seen in the industry for how to use these numbers and how you use these numbers as tools to assess the issues that we're seeing in the vineyard.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, it's very difficult to interpret these results, and no lab is going to interpret for you. And really, the best way is to build up a reference database for yourself. If it's possible, I know these analyses are really expensive, but if you can do baseline and get an idea just per variety, what is the baseline numbers for your grapes, no matter what the technique, but stick with one type of analysis. And I would say you either want a total number or you want a free and bound number. Because the free, unfortunately, gives you a very small part of the picture. If you know what's normal, and then you analyze your grapes, you know what's elevated, and you see, okay, this number did actually result in a wine that's smoke impacted. Then you start getting an idea of how to interpret these results for your own situation. So the total, many times they're measured by acid hydrolysis. That's when they use high heat and low acid conditions to cleave all the glycosides. The problem there is you get very large values, and then people are like, oh my, what does its number mean? The criticism with total numbers is that do all those the glycosides that's released, will all of them actually release during the lifetime of the wine, or is it then estimation? The fact is that is totally possible. But if you always use the total number, then you can still build up a reference for yourself to what does that mean. Perhaps 35 is fine. It's not a problem. That's what's naturally in my grapes. Only from 60 plus does it actually result in a wine that is smoke impacted. And I mean, if people can share results, the quicker we can build a database to really develop an idea for specific varieties, what's normal and what's not normal, and a potential risk.
Yeah, and I think here in Oregon, since ETS, for instance, was so booked out, people ended up going to different labs, and then we ended up trying to compare numbers that were both maybe micro-fermented in a small container at one temperature versus in a bucket, and quickly found that you sort of have to make sure you're looking at those details, because a lot of us, especially in the northern end of the state, are really just learning this for our first time.
Yeah, and especially if you're looking at numbers that's 1 or 2 or just above detection level or quantification, then small variability actually have a huge impact.
Right. So we also did a lot of sharing in our area about techniques, called people that we know in the South for help, in California and in Australia. A few questions about uh, techniques. One, our friends in California talked about wanting to build a bigger wine that then when you do treatment on, it can handle the treatment a little bit more. When we talked to a couple people in Australia, they talked about making wines sort of quickly, get it off the skins quickly, where maybe the volatile phenols might show a little bit more based on what Californians had said. Um, one of the things that I saw was a lot of people keeping their skin contacts very short, 10 days, maybe up to 15, whereas more commonly for those producers, it's more like 20 days or so. Uh, what would you see, do you think, of going from that 10 to 20-day period?
I think by 10 days, you probably have everything that's in the skins extracted in any case. So it probably doesn't matter if you go to 20 days rather than 10. Yeah, it's what you mentioned was two different approaches. I would say very little skin contact is an option if you have a low impacted wine. Rosé or very light red is an option. But like I showed, the one study that I looked at 80% was extracted by the fifth day at 25 degrees fermentation. So that's when we sometimes say, okay, if you know you're going to be smoke impacted and just a light skin contact is not going to help you, then rather make the biggest wine you can, because you know you're going to have to treat it and it's going to remove some of your phenolics. Then you have a bigger base that you're working from and you have more left after the treatment.
Right. Okay. And then going from there, with whites, it makes sense in terms of pressing. But one of the things we didn't know about is, and because those haven't been extracted at that point, the skins. So if you press harder, you're going to get more of those compounds, and you could really taste that. In some cases, with heavy impact, you could really smell it while pressing white. With with reds, what have you seen in terms of volatile phenols coming from the skins while you're pressing?
So we normally do only 7 to 8 days of skin contact. So I only have that reference, but we've definitely seen with pressing, you actually get more volatile phenols. With that mechanical force, you're forcing more out than what naturally extracted into your fermenting mass. So even for reds, I would taste those press fractions and I will keep them separate and analyze them if you can.
Perfect. The last question is about on this thread is about lees. We, um, especially for Chardonnay winemaking, we're looking at use of lees for part of the textural and flavor components in the wine. Also on reds, it's a big part of winemaking styles. Uh, we found that perhaps based on where these location vineyards were in location compared to the fire, the leaves didn't look right. In some cases, they were sort of gray, where you expect them to be that beautiful white. Have you seen any impact from use of leaves uh, in storage of wines in barrel?
So there isn't really any kind of data on that, and I haven't specifically looked at lease, and I haven't seen grey lease. I have to say that. I know the Australians looked at adding yeast hulls to see if that will remove volatile phenols, and it didn't have effect. Obviously, it can still help with body, but it didn't help with the volatile phenol problem. I would say, gray lease, when people ask me, I'm like, evaluate the lease. If it stinks, if it doesn't smell the way it's supposed to and doesn't look the way it's supposed to, then probably just get it off it. That's where I'm going now. But that's there's another thing on my to-do list that we should look at.
I really enjoy it. UC Davis um, professor telling me
We
pay
work.
attention to your notes. Perfect. So to finish off questions about treatments, because we'll be talking about mitigation in the next section, just to clarify a few of these things. No pun intended. Thank you so much.
Yes.
So carbon, is that removing free or total?
It removed mostly free, a little bit of bound. So in
Okay.
total, obviously it does remove total, but most
Right.
free,
Sorry. Wrong word.
yeah, little bit of bound. It did remove
Okay.
some of the bound, but only a small fraction.
And then just to clarify that the enzymes that are actually combining these volatile phenols with glucose and other sugars in the grape, those aren't actually still present in wine. So if you use a glycosidic enzyme that breaks that bond stays broken.
Absolutely. Those enzymes, it's a glucosyl transferase enzyme, they're only in the grape. So you should not get more bound formed in your wine. That enzyme gets totally inhibited by the alcohol environment. And the same thing. So you shouldn't get any bound forming during barrel aging or anything like that. If your numbers in bound is increasing, I will be really worried. And you need to recheck your analysis.
Right. Yeah. Um, so milk is one that people have been working with up here. Wondered if you had any experience with milk and whether that would be the protein being active. I know that the same people have tried casein and not had the same results. There's also lactose involved, which has that aldehydic end to it, and then also fat.
So I haven't actually worked with milk. It's a really interesting. So the protein part, usually the larger phenolics like your flavonoids would, your proanthocyanins will bind better with the proteins in milk. I was wondering if potentially the fat, the fat is, it's mostly lipids made from simple fatty acids, and they're lipophilic. So they may have an interaction with the ring structure. That is also a potential interaction there. And, and the lactose, that's something that we need to look at. I wonder if any people actually sent wine for analysis after removal. It would be very interesting to see what it removes. Obviously, like all the other finding agents, it would lack specificity, right? It will be a general finding agent.
Right. Okay. Molecular imprinted polymers, can we use those here in the US?
Unfortunately not. They're not in the US and they're not approved for use in wine yet. I hope that will change in the future. The product I use came from a company in New Zealand. So they're trying to get into the US market. I'll let you know if that changes.
Okay, that'd be great. And the final question is about ozone. There are a lot of people talking about ozone. We know some people in Napa use it for uh, flooding ozone gas into a container and storing the grapes in there, or people here knowing that story were trying to rinse grapes with ozone. What are your thoughts on ozone?
So unfortunately, at this stage, there's no data to support that ozone actually works or to tell us what ozone actually does when you wash it with oxygenated water. Or, the studies that's there looked at the use of ozone so you can use less sulfur oxide in your wine and things like that. For volatile phenols, the thing is ozone is a very strong oxidizer. And if it actually enters the skin, it will oxidize anything indiscriminately. I don't know if it will oxidize a volatile phenol. It would probably oxidize some terpenes and perhaps other phenolics. I just don't know. So I had the same question from several people during the harvest season. And a winery here did an extensive, very well-controlled study that I'm trying to be a part of so we can see how well it worked. And we have an oxygenator in our brewery, so an ozone maker in our brewery that I actually borrowed. And I did put some ozone on like 5 varieties of grapes, just in bags. And they're in my multitude of samples that needs to be analyzed in the walk-in freezer. So hopefully by next season, I can tell you what I found.
Okay, cool. Those are the questions. I think we're out of time. And we want to thank you so much. And thank you for continuing to come back and talk to us at the symposium.
It's lovely. Hopefully next time I can do it in person.